September 15th of the President?
I'm sorry, Senator, I was reading some notes here, and I didn't, did you want me to repeat to you the September?
What I want to do now, we've had a general overview of the situation. I'm going to try now to focus entirely on the meeting of September 15th.
Right.
And I have an ambition to focus as sharply as I can on it in order to disclose as much information as possible about the September 15th meeting. And what I want to do is to test once again not the credibility of your testimony, but the quality of the evidence. That is it direct evidence, hearsay evidence, or is it circumstantial evidence related to the September 15th meeting? So take a little time with that.
All right. During the morning of the 15th, the indictments had been handed down. I think there was a general sigh of relief at the White House. I had no idea that I was going to be called to the President's office. Mr. Haldeman was quite aware of the fact that I had spent a great deal of time, that he had spent a great deal of time, Mr. Ehrlichman had spent a great deal of time on this matter. In the late afternoon, I received a call requesting I come to the President's office.
Do you know who made the call?
The call came to my secretary, as I recall, and she said that you've been asked to come to the Oval Office, so I don't know who called, and it was probably one of the secretaries that conveyed those types of messages.
Go ahead.
When I entered the office, I can recall that you've been in the office, and you know the way there's two chairs on each side of the President's desk.
The Oval Office?
The Oval Office. As you face the President, on the left-hand chair, Mr. Haldeman was sitting, and they had obviously been conversed in a conversation. And the President asked me to come in, and I stood there for a moment. He said, sit down. I sat on the chair on the other side.
You sat in the right-hand chair?
On the right-hand chair.
That's the one where he usually says no, but go ahead.
I was unaware of that.
Go ahead.
All right. As I tried to describe in my statement, the reception was very warm and very cordial. There was some preliminary pleasantries, and then the next thing that I recall the President very clearly saying to me is that he had been told by Mr. Haldeman that he had been kept posted or made aware of my handling of the various aspects of the Watergate case, and the fact that the case, the indictments had now been handed down. No one in the White House had been indicted. They stopped at Liddy.
Stop, just for 1 second. Let's examine those particular words just for a second. That no one in the White House had been indicted. Is that as near the exact language as you can think? I don't know. So I just want to know.
Yes, well, it was a reference to the fact that the indictments had been handed down. And it was quite obvious that no one in the White House had been indicted on the indictments handed down.
Well, did he say that?
Did he say that no one in the White House had been handed down? I can't really recall whether he said it. I recall a reference to the fact that the indictments were now down, and that he was aware of that and the status of the indictments, and expressed what to me was a pleasure to the fact that it had stopped at Mr. Liddy.
Tell me what he said.
Well, as I say, he told me I had done a good job.
Now, let's talk about the pleasure. He expressed pleasure. The pleasure indictments had stopped at Mr. Liddy. Can you, just for the purposes of our information, tell us what language he used?
Make it very clear that the pleasure that it had stopped there is an inference of mine based on, as I told Senator Gurney yesterday, the impression I had as a result of his complimenting me.
All right. Can you give us any information? Can you give us any further insight into what the President actually said?
Yes, I can recall he told me that he appreciated how difficult a job it had been for me.
Is that close to the exact language?
Yes, that is close to the exact language. That stuck very clearly in my mind because I recall my response to that was that I didn't feel that I could take credit. I thought that others had done much more difficult things, and by that I was referring to the fact that Mr. Magruder had perjured himself. There was not an extended discussion from there as to any more of my involvement. I had been complimented. I told him I couldn't take the credit, and then we moved into a discussion of the status of the case.
All right, before you get to the status, and let's lay that aside just for a second, because I do want to hear about that too, but this really is, I don't mean to be melodramatic, but this is really a terribly important moment in history, as you know. This meeting in the afternoon in the Oval Office in Washington on September 15, 1972, and you were there, the President was there, and Mr. Haldeman
was there.
What was the President's demeanor? What was his attitude? What was the expression on his face, the quality of his voice?
Well, as I said, when I walked in, it was very, very warm, very cordial. They were smiling, they were happy, they were relaxed. The President, as I think I said earlier this morning, was about to go somewhere, and I think that actually was delaying his departure to have this conversation with me. The fact that I had not been in to see the President, other than on a rather mechanical activity before that on dealing with his testamentary papers, indicated so clearly that Haldeman had thought that the President should compliment me for my handling of this matter, and that that was one of the reasons I had probably been called over, and the President had done it at Mr. Haldeman's request.
All right. Now, tell us about as you started to say before I interrupted you, the status of the case.
All right. He was interested in knowing if it was likely. Well, let me before I go into that, let me say something else that I recall. When we talked about the fact that the indictments had been handed down, at some point, and after the compliment, I told him at that point that we had managed, that the matter had been contained. It had not come into the White House. I didn't say that. I said it had been contained.
Did you say anything beyond it had been contained?
No, I did not. I used that. I recall very clearly using that expression, that it had been contained.
That's an important word. It has been contained.
That is right.
Now, what was the President or Mr. Haldeman's reaction to that word? Because that's a rather significant word, I think.
Well, I've got to say this. I wasn't studying the President's face or Mr. Haldeman's face this time. I had not ever had a one-on-one with the President before. I must confess I was a little nervous in there. They were trying to make me as relaxed as possible and make it as cordial as possible, but I was quite naturally nervous. This was a man who is the most important man in the Western world, and here I am having a conversation with him for the first time one-on-one. So I wasn't studying his reactions, and it wasn't until I started meeting with him more frequently later that the tenor of our conversations changed. And
well, you see what I'm driving at, I'm sure, Mr. Dean. If someone said that the investigation has been contained, it might evoke a question. It might create a startled look on one's face. It might be taken for granted, and that might be important to shed light on the state of the knowledge of the person whom you were having the conversation.
Everyone seemed to understand what I was talking about. It didn't invoke any questions, and I was going on to say that I didn't think it could be contained indefinitely. That I said that this is, there are a lot of hurdles that have to be leaped down the road before it will indefinitely remain contained, and I was trying to tell the President at that time that I wasn't sure the cover-up even then would last indefinitely.
This, once again, is a terribly important area of inquiry, so let me interrupt you again and take you over it one more time, that you told the President I don't think it can continue to be contained.
That is correct.
Are those close to your exact words?
That's very close to my words, because I had told him it had been contained to that point, and I wasn't sure that it would be contained indefinitely.
What was his reaction to that?
As I say, I don't recall any particular reaction.
Was there any statement by him or by Mr. Haldeman at that point on that statement?
No, not to my recollection.
All right, so go ahead.
It was then we turned to the status of the litigation, the criminal case, as I recall, in the sequence of the conversation. And he wanted to know when this matter was likely to come to trial. And I told him it very much would depend upon which judge the case was assigned to.
Go ahead.
At that point, it had not been assigned to any judge at all. Another point that came out, as I testified early in our conversation, was the fact that he told me for the first time that I'd ever heard this, that shortly after he had assumed office, that Mr. Hoover had been over to visit with him. And he told me that Mr. Hoover had informed him that his 1968 campaign had been bugged. And the President said this is something that we may be able to use ourselves at some point down the road to explain the fact that we've been subject to the same type of activity.
Did you look into that?
Not until many months later, which is...
You already testified.
Yes, I have.
Conversation. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Mr. Dean. Tell me anything else you can at all, no matter how minute about the meeting of September 15th.
The next matter I recall is the fact we did get into a discussion about the civil cases.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dean. Thank you very much.
The next thing I recall that occurred was a discussion that ensued about the civil cases. He asked me some questions about the civil cases. And it was in the course of this conversation that I told him what I knew at that point in time about the status of the civil cases, wherever they were, and I was relatively familiar at that point in time with the precise status of the cases. It was also as a result of this conversation that we got into the discussion, or I told him that I had learned from the lawyers at the re-election committee that they had been making, or they had somebody who was making an ex parte contact with the judge who had jurisdiction over the principal suit that was the greatest concern, which was the suit by Mr. O'Brien, or Larry O'Brien and the DNC.
Is this, once again, close to the exact language you used?
Yes, I did not know who it was that was making the contacts at that time for certain. And so I just told him that the lawyers at the re-election committee are making ex parte contact, or have ex parte contacts, and are hoping to get some favorable rulings.
Did the President make any remark at that point, or did Mr. Haldeman?
I recall the President said something to the effect, well, that's helpful.
Is that close to his exact language?
Yes, sir.
Was there anything else?
We talked about the common cause suit as well, and I told him that I didn't think it was any problem. This was a suit that was trying to bring or identify the donors or the contributors of some $10 million of unidentified campaign monies that had not been reported prior to April 7th. The suit, I told him I didn't think would be a problem because the lawyers, the re-election committee, felt that they could tie this one up in discovery for quite a while.
What did the President say to that?
I don't recall any specific comment to that. I think as we were going through some of these descriptions, I was just reporting as best I could, and I don't recall him giving me what his reaction was at that point.
Well, you understand why I'm asking you?
Yes, I do.
Fine. Now, I don't mean to shorten your description of the September 15th meeting, but for the sake of moving on, were there other important matters discussed at that time?
Well, yes, the matter of the Patman hearings did come up because the President was aware of the fact, I assume from his news summaries of the newspapers, that there was likely to be congressional inquiry on the House side. And he asked me who was handling that. I told him that Richard Cook, a member of the Congressional Relations Staff, who had worked with the Patman Committee at one point in time, was doing the principal work on it. He then told me that Mr. Timmons should be spending his time and get on top of it, something that would be very close to the language he used.
Mr. Dean, excuse me, I see we have a vote signal from the Senate, and the committee will stand in recess until we can return. Thank you.
So it appears that Senator Baker is going to do a word-by-word analysis of John Dean's meetings with President Nixon following the Watergate break-in. Public television's complete coverage of the Senate hearings will continue after a pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Robert MacNeil.
Well, the senators are back from their first floor vote of the afternoon, and Senator Baker has more questions about that September 15th meeting in the Oval Office.
Committee will come to order. The chairman was necessarily called away for the rest of the afternoon. For the information of the committee, I might indicate that he requested that we run as long as practical and that we continue with the present rotation arrangement. So as soon as I can conclude my queries, I'll yield then to Senator Montoya, and after that to Senator Weicker. Mr. Dean, do you have any objection if we try to go, say, till a few minutes before 6 tonight?
I'll hold up as long as I can, Senator.
And if you need to break or would like to break in the course of things, if you let me know, we'd be happy to do that. Mr. Dean, have we finished with the delineation of the September 15th meeting?
No, I don't believe we have. We were discussing the fact that we were talking about how to deal with the Patman Committee because this was another threat to, it was a dual threat, I might add. One was the fact that it would be adverse publicity as a result of the hearings, and secondly, there was always the potential that this might stumble into something.
Were those words used?
I believe what we talked about adverse publicity, and there's no telling where this thing may go.
Do you remember who said that?
I said that.
Do you remember what the president's reaction was?
Well, he asked me who was covering the hearings, and I told him that Dick Cook was covering the hearings.
Covering meaning what person on the White House staff had responsibility for that?
Yes, that's correct, because I explained to him that Mr. Cook had formerly worked for the House Banking and Currency Committee. And at that point he said that Mr. Timmons should get on top of those hearings. We then, the conversation turned to the press coverage that had been following the Watergate incident. And during this discussion, he told me that I should keep a good list of people who were giving us trouble in the press because we would give them trouble after the election.
This was stated by the president.
That is correct.
What else was said by him or by Mr. Haldeman or by you in that context?
Well, this evolved immediately into a conversation about the Internal Revenue Service and using the Internal Revenue Service to audit returns of people. I had, again, we were on, I knew the wavelength that we were talking on because I'd had similar requests in the past to institute audits against people. And I told the president that the Internal Revenue Service had been...
Wait. You knew the wavelength because you knew of your previous use of the Internal Revenue Service?
That is correct. I had requests from Mr. Haldeman in the past that certain individuals have audits commenced on them.
What did you do with that?
Well, the one time I recall getting one, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it because I was always reluctant to call Mr. Walters at that time, who was the head of the Internal Revenue Service, so I went to Mr. Caulfield, who had friends in the Internal Revenue Service, and he said, I think I know a way that this can be done. Apparently there's some system where the appropriate anonymous letter comes into a regional office, and if it's those who know how to do this can write the right letter, and sufficient information will prompt an audit on that individual.
Is that known as the informer statute?
No, I don't believe it's an informer statute. It's just a something that will be of sufficient attention to that regional office or that branch of the audit branch of that regional office that will institute an audit. I went on to tell the President that we didn't seem to have the clout at the White House to get this done. I had talked to Walters about it in the past and told him that I had had instructions from Mr. Haldeman on one occasion, and he said that he brought to my attention that the making the IRS political, and said that you'll recall what happened back in '48 with Truman and that administration and the cleaning house and the changing of Internal Revenue Service. And these were all new facts to me, and what he was telling me is that don't call me with this sort of thing.
You know who they were? Tell me, if you don't mind telling me, what you did. Did you in fact set up an audit? Your counsel is trying to reach you, and I think he may have something to say.
He just said, which is quite accurate, I don't mind telling you any fact that's true. And
Well, I'd say that was a very lawyer-like piece of advice.
So in this instance, there was, the one I was referring to in the past, there was an audit commenced. Now, I, for example, read a memorandum into the record this morning for a request of some material requested to the committee that had to do with an audit of Mr. Gibbons of the Teamsters Union. I merely put that in my file, and that's where it's remained to this day.
Well, shorten this, and I don't mean to shorten it if you care to go on with it, but did you, in fact, initiate IRS inquiries or audits on certain people as a result of suggestions from the White House staff or the President?
Well, the President at this time, and let's hope to keep in the focus you want to keep in, told me to keep a good list so that these could be, that we'd take care of these people after the election. And then we went into I told him that IRS was a democratically oriented bureaucracy, and to do something like that was a virtual impossibility. And then the conversation moved to the fact that he was going to make some dramatic changes in all of the agencies. And at this point in time, I can remember Mr. Haldeman opened up his pad and started making notes as to what the President was describing as to his post-election intentions as a result of the President giving his thoughts on what he wanted to do post-election with all of the agencies and as far as changing personnel. Mr. Haldeman also injected in the conversation at that time that he had already commenced a project to determine which people and which agencies were responsive and were not responsive to the White House.
Mr. Dean, in deference to my colleagues and the requirements of time, let me try to refocus now. Is there anything else about the September 15th meeting that would shed light on the President's knowledge and the scope and depth of his knowledge, if any, of the Watergate break-in on June 17th, or the cover-up activities so-called thereafter and prior to September?
I think I described pretty well the full of the 30, 40-minute meeting, however long it was. I say the end of the meeting turned to rather unrelated chatter about a book I was reading.
It seems to me then that the extent to which the September 15th meeting would give us some guidance in our inquiry as to what the President knew and when he knew it, that you depend on a combination of things. You depend on your experience at the White House as a staffer, with the interrelationships of staff and the President's staff, the remarks which did not relate directly to Watergate, that is, the break-in at Watergate, or to the concealment of the involvements and responsibilities for it, but based on the general tenor of the conversation, you gained the impression, I believe you said, to paraphrase your testimony, that the President knew that there was an ongoing counter-effort, at least, And when you couple that with your knowledge of the relationships and circumstances, that you concluded then in your own mind that he knew something, and I don't believe you testified quite exactly what, about the events involved.
Well, I might say that one thing that did come specifically out of the conversation was that we had leaped the hurdle of the Justice Department investigation, and the indictments were down. Now the looming problem were the Patman Committee hearings, and the President gave very, very clear instructions that Mr. Timmons should get on top of those so they did not get out of hand, because that was the next problem. It was also very, very clear that I was to follow up with the civil litigation and see anything I could do to make sure that didn't get out of hand.
But in an effort to summarize it, and believe me, I'm not trying to distort the meaning of your testimony by summary, but in effect, you drew inferences from the totality of this conversation and the circumstances and relationships as you knew it. You drew inferences from that led you to believe that on September 15th, the President knew something about at least the efforts to counter the Watergate, and possibly, in fact, about Watergate itself.
That is correct.
But there is no direct statement about Watergate, CRP involvement, the President's knowledge of it, or the cover-up. There is no Category 1 information about that.
Other than as I have recited, and I have chosen not to place interpretations on these, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I think that information is very useful, and you understand, of course, Mr. Dean, that in the course of things we're going to explore further the content of that meeting and the perceptions
I understand
that the other parties had of that meeting. As you know, Mr. Haldeman will be a witness before this committee. The only other person present was the President. And I'm not prepared to say at this point how we may be able to gain access to the President's knowledge and perception of that meeting. But in a three-way meeting, I think it's important to this committee that we have all the information we can get. So the information you've just given me in rather good detail will now be structured alongside with the rest of the record to test against the testimony of Mr. Haldeman and hopefully against statements by the President in whatever manner that can be arranged. Now, what is the time of your next meeting with the President?
on this subject.
Yes, sir.
Well, you asked, there were certain events that led up to my next meeting, and they were the events which occurred at La Costa, in which or followed La Costa, in which I was requested to, by Mr. Haldeman when I returned from Florida. I'd gone from California to Florida, and had spent a week or so, just about a week in Florida. And when I returned on the 19th or 20th, Mr. Haldeman asked me to prepare an agenda, and I think that agenda is a rather important document along the line of questioning you're asking.
I'd like you to go into that, but before you do, let me reiterate. The focus of my inquiry is on what did the President know,
and when did it went directly to the President.
And when did he know it? So
that's correct.
As you go into your testimony and as you refer to the several documents that I believe you may have before you, try to keep in mind that I'm not at this moment talking about other matters and detail. I'm not talking about Ellsberg at this point, the enemy list at this point. I'm talking about what the President knew. So tell me what additional information you can give me in that respect, preferably in terms of your meetings with the President or conversations with him, and then in terms of what secondary or circumstantial evidence you have.
My next meeting with the President was on the 27th of February of this year. Now, to explain this meeting, I believe it's necessary to explain this agenda, because I believe that is in part the reason I commenced having meetings with the President. A number of decisions have been made at La Costa. A number of areas had come up after that. As I said, on the 19th or 20th, I was asked to prepare an agenda. The matters that were on that agenda related to a meeting between yourself and the President, the concept of sending former Secretary Stans up for confirmation, and this was a concept that had been discussed with Mr. Haldeman.
Are you referring to an exhibit now, Mr.
Yes, I am. It's number 32.
32. Go ahead, sir.
Sending Secretary Stans up for confirmation. The confirmation hearings were thought of as a means of diffusing the Watergate hearings and getting as much out to the public as possible and lessen the impact of these hearings. And I was given, per my discussion with Mr. Haldeman, I would have the assignment to go talk to Mr. Stans to see if he was interested upon his return from being out of the country. The next matter on the agenda was what to do with Mr. Magruder, which was going to require a presidential decision. These were all matters that were going in for presidential decision.
Who asked you to prepare the agenda?
Mr. Haldeman. It was based on a conversation that Mr. Haldeman and I had. Some of the points had come up at La Costa, some of them had not. For example, I believe Mr. Timmons and you had a conversation subsequent to the time we returned from La Costa, and the arrangements for that meeting were worked out in that time frame.
Were you advised, just so the record is clear on that point, were you advised of the conversation I had with Mr. Timmons?
Mr. Timmons did advise me of the fact that you wanted to talk to the President, you wanted to seek some guidance, I believe, in the areas of executive privilege, what was going to occur. Mr. Timmons had the interpretation that you wanted to be helpful to the White House, and one of the questions was whether you would object to staff being present or not when you met. Timmons did not feel that you would object, and the interpretation of the White House was that this would be an excellent chance to find out what your plans were and to hopefully set up a channel of communications to work with you.
Just a little bit to follow on, partly for self-serving purposes and partly to clarify the record at this point. After the meeting was held with the President in February, did you receive some information about what the conversation was about?
Yes, I did.
And would you relate that?
Do you want me to take that out of order right now?
If you don't mind.
Certainly. The President reported to me, first of all, Mr. Haldeman reported to me, and subsequently the President reported to me that you had urged the President to send members of the White House staff up to this committee as quickly as he could get them up here and waive executive privilege. The President told you that he was going to hold the line at written interrogatories.
Mr. Dean, would you proceed then with your sequences? Before you do, I see we have another roll call vote. If the committee is agreeable, we'll recess at this point until we can return from that vote. The senators continue to divide their time between the Senate chamber and the committee hearing. After this vote, Senator Baker will resume his cross-examination. The committee will come to order. It's my information from the floor of the Senate that there will be a series of other votes tonight, and the Senate will be in session probably until 9 or 10 o'clock, that for the edification of my colleagues. But at the time we ended, Mr. Dean, I believe you were about to tell us of a February meeting.
Yes, Senator. You asked me to give you what led up to a given set of meetings, and we had turned to the immediate agenda, but I think that I ought to be complete and full in answering the way you requested I answer, give you the intervening sequences that occurred just in highlight again, directly relating to what occurred in the February meetings. There was the intervening event of the payment of silence money, and then the lack of that money, and a serious problem with differences between Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Haldeman and Ehrlichman about who would raise that money. There was also the intervening event of clemency being assured to Mr. Hunt, in which Mr. Ehrlichman informed me that I was present when he told Mr. Colson and myself he was going in to see the President about it. He subsequently informed me he talked to the President. Mr. Colson had informed me he talked to the President about it. And subsequently there was another meeting in Mr. Ehrlichman's office when it was described how the assurance was given to Mr. Hunt's lawyer, Mr. Bittman.
Before you go on with that, Mr. Dean, so that you have some further preview of the subject matter I'm going to cover, it would appear now that I probably may not finish my questions in this first round, but just so you know that I don't intend to skip those things, I have on my list the break-in, the cover-up, the so-called enemy list, executive privilege, executive clemency, domestic intelligence, Internal Revenue Service, Judge Ritchie, and a number of other things. So each of those I consider to be a subject that I want to explore more fully, but for the sake of time, I'd like to focus.
All I'm doing is highlighting, as I just did right then, what was leading up to the February meetings.
All right, sir, but for the sake of time, I'd like to focus at this moment on what the President knew and when he knew it. So
yes,
let's
sir.
start first with direct information that you have.
All right, I'm going to give you a document that went directly to the President, and I think that the fastest way to handle that is for me just to read the document. We've already covered the first part of it.
What document is it?
This is exhibit number 32. The first part was what we just discussed, Baker meeting with the President. Baker requested secret meeting, Ray Watergate hearings. Baker told Timmons he wants guidance, but to maintain his purity in the Senate, he doesn't want anyone to know of the meeting with the President. Timmons believes Baker wants to help. Timmons does not feel Baker would object if there were staff present during the meeting, so long as the fact the meeting never gets out. The meeting would be an excellent chance to find out what Baker plans to do, set up, channel to work with him. Now, this was based on a conversation, as I believe we discussed in the executive session, of Mr. Timmons' perception of a conversation he had with you. Secondly, sending up Stans for confirmation. We don't know if Stans wants to do this, but we do know he wants to be rehabilitated and isn't afraid to tell his story publicly. Confirmation hearings would help diffuse Watergate hearings, and the more of this we get to the public, the less impact the Watergate hearings per se will have. This should be resolved quickly because it will only be helpful if it occurs prior to Watergate hearings. Stans is requested to see Dean February 28th upon his return from Jamaica. Third point, what to do with Magruder. Jeb wants to return to the White House Bicentennial Project. May be vulnerable, Sloan, in parens, until Senate hearings are completed. Jeb personally is prepared to withstand confirmation hearings. 4, use of Buchanan as observer spokesman to keep press coverage honest. Watergate press coverage to date has been dishonest and libelous. Pat could call them to task. The hearings are going to be partisan. Pat could make certain the public understands this. Teddy Kennedy is the moving force behind the hearings. This can and should be documented. Pat can do this well. The public does not perceive Buchanan as being that close to the President. The basic question is whether the White House is going to sit quietly and take the unwarranted abuse that is bound to come from the hearings. We can't run a secret counter PR effort, so why not do it openly and respectfully? Pat can do that. Buchanan's role will eliminate much of the heat that Ziegler will otherwise receive, and Ziegler could even have Pat brief from time to time. 5th point on the agenda, getting the AG, the Attorney General, back on the reservation. The Attorney General is merely biding his time until he returns to private sector. The Attorney General is extremely loyal to the President, and if asked to take an active concern in these hearings and their fallout, would do so. Otherwise, he will probably do what is best for his own self-interest. Attorney General should be asked to remain in office at least 1 full year from this date. That is, until the hearings have passed, because the hearings may well result in requests for additional action by the Department of Justice. The AG can get Henry Peterson, who has the greatest loyalty for the Attorney General, to handle sensitive problems with ease. We can't afford bitterness in the Department of Justice, nor can we risk a new Attorney General being able to grapple with some of the potential problems.
Mr. Dean,
Now, as a result,
this was dictated by you?
This was a result of a meeting I had with Mr. Haldeman discussing the agenda. These were matters that had come up some of them had come up in La Costa. I was asked to boil them down into a paper to go in to discuss with the President.
All right. When was this paper prepared?
This was prepared the 19th or 20th of February this year.
Now, some or all of these things, or at least some of these things, never occurred that are dealt with.
Well, I got a response back from each of the points on here. As I will subsequently turn here, there was a subsequent agenda prepared for the meeting between yourself and the President.
Which one is this?
That would be exhibit number 33. Mr. Stans, I was asked to talk to him to see if he was interested in being sent up for a confirmable post and to explore to see if there was any post that he was interested in. He and I discussed it, and he didn't have any particular post in mind and didn't particularly want to do it after he gave it some consideration. There was a presidential decision that Mr. Magruder could not return to the White House staff. There was also a decision by the President that Mr. Buchanan could not be used as an observer spokesman because the President, I was told, felt that Mr. Buchanan was too close to him, had been with him too long, relating back to even pre-68. And finally, there was a meeting, and there's a subsequent agenda I have in the exhibits for the meeting with the Attorney General. Now, as I say, these all led up to what later occurred in my discussions on the 27th and 28th with the President. Let me turn to the next exhibit. This was again requested by Mr. Haldeman. He said, prepare it, do not send it through normal channels because it was to be an totally off-the-record meeting between 30 and 45 minutes. Originally there was to be staff, either Dean or Timmons. That was decided there would be no staff present, so both were crossed out on the record. The general area or general description was potential matters for discussion with Senator Baker. General, take Baker's pulse and find out how much he wants to help keep this from becoming a political circus. Baker can be assured that no one in the White House had any knowledge there was going to be a break-in and bugging of the DNC. If Baker appears to be truly desirous of cooperating, and the fact he is seeking guidance may so indicate, he might be told that there are matters unrelated to the bugging incident per se, for example, Segretti, Kalmbach, that could be embarrassing and tarnish good people whose motives were the highest. Surely he can appreciate that things which occur at the White House have a degree of sensitivity that occur nowhere else in government. The 1968 bugging, tell Baker that J. Edgar Hoover personally informed the President shortly after taking office that his campaign had been bugged, presently seeking to obtain documentation and evidence of that 1968 incident. Next subject on the potential agenda, or potential matters for discussion, was appearances of White House staff members before the Senate committee. Statement coming out shortly on the matter of executive privilege. Draft attached. I recall that when I first sent this document into the President, the draft was not attached. He was in his executive office building. I don't know if that's where you met with him or not, but I had a frantic call to get a copy of that draft down to him.
On executive privilege?
On executive privilege.
Do you know why?
I don't know why.
Go ahead.
I assume maybe you were meeting with him, or it was imminent you were going to be in a meeting with him. Cannot say at this time if such witnesses will be provided to the committee. Must wait to determine how issue develops. A possible resolution of the problem may be that when the committee believes a White House staff member is essential as a witness, we can compromise and agree upon sworn written interrogatories, that should be, rather than interrogation. General guidance, seek to get the hearings over as quickly as possible because they're really a potential witch hunt. The President can note that hearings of this type damage all government officials and institutions of government. The public wants to believe the worst about all politicians, and hearings of this type are going to damage all elected officials. Committee procedures should protect the rights of the minority members to information, calling its own witnesses, notice of meetings, etc. Minority counsel should be tough, aware of the way things operate in Washington, be able to handle a fellow like Sam Dash, who has been selected as majority counsel. Dash is a partisan. Communications with the White House. Wally Johnson should be initial contact point, but if Baker feels he wants to raise something he chooses not to discuss with Wally, then arrangements can be made to meet with Dean. Note, frankly, the naming of Dean as the man who deals with the President on such matters preserves our posture on executive privilege should Dean be called as a witness. Note, at the bottom, have just learned that Baker publicly announced the appointment of Fred Thompson as minority counsel. Timmons has recommended George Webster as our candidate.
Just out of curiosity, Mr. Dean, since this agenda was prepared at rather some length, first, did you dictate it?
Yes, I did, and again, this was on the meeting that had occurred at La Costa and discussions I had with Mr. Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
Can you enlighten us, I know, but would you enlighten us on how much, if any, of this agenda was covered at that meeting?
I only know what came out, what was reported to me by the President and Mr. Haldeman, that the thrust of the meeting really was your calling upon the President to
waive executive
privilege is correct. And I also, the President told me that you agreed the hearing should be over as soon as possible. If they linger, it will be damaging.
It also is your information that there was not a suggestion as to minority counsel because minority counsel was announced on that same day.
That is correct.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dean.
The next significant document leading up to my meetings that some of these things were discussed on the 27th and 28th was a request again by Mr. Haldeman.
You have a...
Oh, this is, yes, sir. This is exhibit number 34. And I have a cover note on this. I had hand carried the other agenda over to Mr. Haldeman, whereas this one, there was a little more time. He had asked me not to send it through normal channels. So there's a cover note on Memorandum 4, H.R. Haldeman from John Dean. I did not use the prescribed format because I understand you do not want this to pass into channels. Talking points for meeting with the Attorney General.
I think we just talked out, Mr. Dean. I think that's another roll call vote. Does the committee like to try to alternate? We're on 10-minute voting cycles. I'm not sure we can do that. I think we better receive.
I have one or two very brief questions. I think I can complete mine in 5 minutes while you go vote, and I'll ask my questions, and then when you return, I'll go vote.
All right. Well, let's do that. Does that suit you, Mr. Dean?
Whatever pleases the chair.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Dean, you've been in the chair now for 4 days, and I know how weary you must be. And I'll be extremely brief. There are one or two things I would like some clarification on. You have testified repeatedly that even though you were counsel to the President, you had no direct access to the President except going through Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman. Is that correct?
That is correct. In fact, Senator, I think the documents I've just referred to we're talking about direct meetings with the President. I'm asked to prepare an agenda that shows the very pattern that exists in and of itself, where I sent everything I did through either Haldeman or Ehrlichman for anything of this nature.
Do you know who was responsible for that organizational setup?
Mr. Haldeman had basically told me who I would report to. Mr. Ehrlichman had been the former counsel, and when I got into legal areas that were of interest to him, I also supplied legal assistance through my office to the domestic counsel on occasion.
Then Mr. Haldeman informed you of that organizational setup. Is that a correct answer?
That's correct, sir. There was just it wasn't a matter of being informed. It just existed when you arrived. When I started there, I was alone. I finally persuaded him to let me get one assistant. Slowly, as the workload of my office increased, I got 2 or 3 more. I had inherited a couple people when I came on that when Mr. Houston was there, but he never really worked directly for me. He was taking his assignments from Mr. Haldeman or doing speech writing for Mr. Price. And Mr. Caulfield, when I first came, was still doing assignments for Mr. Ehrlichman.
When were you told that you had no direct access to the President, but must go through Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman?
Well, Senator, I had dealings with the White House before I even joined the staff, and I had a pretty good feel for the operation of the White House from working on developing various legislative programs that went over to the White House and talking to people over there. I'd gotten to know a number of people before I even went to the staff, and that's just the way it was.
Did you ever try to obtain direct access to the President without going through Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman?
There is no way that would be possible, Senator. If, for example, you were to pick up the telephone and call the President, the call would be transferred immediately by the operator to Mr. Haldeman or some other member of the staff. But generally, if, say, another staff member calling the call would go to Haldeman to clear the call, he'd want to know why you were going to call and what the substance of it was, so you just, in a sense, were reporting to Mr. Haldeman.
Did you ever see anyone try to go in the office of the President without going through Mr. Haldeman and Mr.
I think I made reference in my testimony that I believe there's a reporter in this room, Mr. Mollenhoff, who used to be on the White House staff, and I noted on occasion, in looking back through some old records, he had a special counsel title and worked in some areas where he was, in a sense, what I might call also firefighting, trying to put out problems of conflicts and dealing in areas like that. And I saw a number of memoranda that he had sent to the President, which never got there, and they had been returned by Mr. Haldeman.
You never saw him try to walk into the President's office?
No, I didn't. There are a lot of Secret Service agents around the President's office, I might add also.
One other thing I'd like some clarification on. On Monday, I asked you a question that appears on page 2465, line 23 of the record. Did you think it was part of an effort to make you the fall guy in the plan? And your answer begins immediately, of course, after the question, but then beginning on line 8 of page 2466, you stated something that I would like more clarification on. I had seen situations like this occur where people who had not actually done something take the blame for it to avoid embarrassing others higher up. And I felt it was a real possibility. Now, were you referring to the situation at the White House?
Yes, sir, I was.
Could you give us an illustration of some instances of that type?
Well, I can give you instances that I think they're public knowledge of. I think I've already alluded to one because another member of this panel had a follow-up question of this nature. The one I've already referred to was the fact that Mr. Malik took the blame, so to speak, for instigating an investigation of Mr. Daniel Shore. Another interesting situation, there were, during the 70 campaign, a rather...
Now, who was he taking the blame for?
Mr. Haldeman.
Mr. Haldeman. All right. Go ahead.
Or the President.
All right. Proceed.
Another instance that occurs to me is when, during the 70 congressional campaign, there were a number of rather rough, you might call questionable political ethical standard ads run that got the name of the Shipley ads because Mr. Shipley had signed the ads. The ultimate blame came to rest at the White House, and it came to rest on Chuck Colson.
You were saying then in your testimony, as I understand it, that it was common practice in the White House when something went wrong for subordinates to take the blame for their superiors. Is that your testimony?
Yes, it is, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. I must rush to the Senate floor and vote, and the committee will stand in recess until the Vice Chairman or some other member return. Thank you, sir.
So Senator Talmadge has raised still a new ethical question, that of scapegoating. And in a moment, Senator Baker will pursue it even further with John Dean. Public television's coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As the hearings resume after a floor vote in the Senate, Senator Baker has some questions related to the break-in at the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist.
Committee will come to order. I understand that Senator Talmadge left to avoid missing this last roll call vote with possibly a question left unanswered. I was not here, so I can't say, but is there anything further you wish to add, Mr. Dean?
He was asking me about people who had taken the blame for their superiors, the White House, from some examples, and I had cited two examples.
Dean, as Senator Thomas was leaving, I think the last words you said were that the person taking the blame was Chuck Colson and left it, and I think the follow-up that Senator Thomas would have asked is, who was he taking the blame for?
He was taking the blame for Mr. Haldeman, who had authorized the ads. There's one other example that gets into an area I believe you indicated you were going to question me on, and that is based on information that I have directly from Mr. Krogh, that it appears to me that based on a conversation I had with Mr. Krogh, that he is taking the blame for something. Pardon?
You know who?
I believe the President of the United States.
Maybe you ought to elaborate on that a little.
Well, it was on either the 28th or 29th of March that Mr. Krogh came to my office. He stopped by to express his sympathy for the adverse publicity I had received as a result of the Gray hearings and asked me how I was holding up, and I said, fine, it's not very pleasant, but my hands are tied and I can't speak. He said, then began a discussion of how he had been haunted ever since he'd left the White House about his own experiences there. And then we got into a discussion of the fact that there was evidence within the files of the Department of Justice indicating leads that might let the investigators from this committee discover the fact of the Ellsberg burglary, and we began discussing it. I asked him then if that had been authorized by Mr. Ehrlichman, and he told me, because knowing Mr. Krogh pretty well, and knowing that Mr. Krogh was at a similar level as myself, and wouldn't start something of that dimension without clearing it with someone. And he told me no, that to the best of his knowledge, Mr. Ehrlichman hadn't learned about it until after the fact, and told me that his orders had come directly from the Oval Office. And I was somewhat surprised, and so surprised I said, "You've got to be kidding." And he repeated again, no, he said they came from the Oval Office.
This was Mr. Krogh speaking?
Yes, sir. And subsequently, of course, he has, under a sworn statement, said that he was totally responsible for the matter.
Mr. Dean, it's now a little after 4:30, and in deference to my colleagues, I'm not going to try to finish with the list of questions and topics that I outlined to you earlier. What I would like to do for about 10 minutes, almost 15 minutes, say to 4:45, is to go once again to the narrow focus of what the President knew and when he knew it, relative to Watergate. So would you please move then to the next situation?
Yes, sir.
That would shed any light on that.
And that would be a document which was forwarded to the President that I was just referring to as we ended our conversation, and it's exhibit number 34 for a talking points for a meeting with the Attorney General. This was requested that I prepare this by Mr. Haldeman and send it not through normal channels for a meeting, but rather directly to him because of the sensitivity of the document. Background: Klein Deans is dividing his time until he returns to private law practice. He's discussed joining several law firms and has a particularly attractive offer from one that he would probably like to accept. Klein Deans is less than enthusiastic about helping to solve some of the tough problems related to the forthcoming Watergate hearings. He doesn't want to get himself involved in any controversy at this time. The morale of the Department of Justice is low because they're extremely loyal to Klein Deans, but think the White House is trying to force him out. Klein Deans is extremely loyal to the President and will do anything asked of him by the President. Recommendations: Klein Deans should be asked to remain in office at least one full year from this date. That is, until after the Watergate hearings have passed, because the hearings may well result in a request for additional action by the Department of Justice. We can't afford bitterness at the Justice Department, nor can we risk a new Attorney General being able to handle some of the potential problems. Klein Deans should be asked to follow the hearings closely and keep us apprised of any potential problems from a Department of Justice standpoint. Klein Deans should be given the feeling that he is an important member of the team and not merely because of these hearings is he being asked to stay on. Now, when
Mr. Klein Deans did not stay on, is that right?
His resignation was accepted, I believe, on the 30th of April.
Just out of curiosity, is it your personal knowledge that Mr. Klein Deans' resignation was not requested, but rather was tendered on by Mr. Klein Deans?
That is my understanding.
Go ahead.
The first meeting that I had after these series of documents were exchanged, and I was told of the results of the meetings in the first instance by Mr. Haldeman, and subsequently by the President himself when I met with him. That meeting was on the 27th of February. And it was at this meeting that the President asked me to report directly to him on all Watergate matters. There had been a great exchange of this type of memorandum back and forth into the President's office and out. He indicated to me at that time that this was consuming a great deal of time of Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman, and that at that time he also indicated to me that they were principals, and he felt that I could be more objective in this matter. We had, I think, a lengthy discussion of that this morning with one of the members of the panel. As I indicated, it was at this meeting that the President also repeated what had earlier been reported to me by Mr. Haldeman about your meeting with the President, in which you had told the President that you suggested he waive executive privilege. He had told you that he was going to hold the line at written interrogatories, and he asked me at that time what did I think about that, and I said I certainly thought that written interrogatories could be handled. He also discussed the fact that he didn't want Mr. Haldeman and Ehrlichman to appear on the Hill.
Incidentally, Mr. Dean, at that point, as we know, you are here without a claim of executive privilege. Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Dean, Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman are under subpoena. It is our understanding that they will appear without a claim of executive privilege. Can you identify the point at which this position at the White House was reversed and that those privileges indeed were waived?
I believe it was probably as to the statements on executive privilege continued to change after, it was certainly after the April 30th resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman and my departure from the White House staff.
Do you know who recommended the change position?
I do not. I was not privy to the conversations at that point in time.
But in any event, there is no claim now of executive privilege or attorney-client privilege as far as you're concerned.
That is correct.
As far as we know, as far as the other witnesses.
That is correct. Counsel has just reminded me of something that at one point in time we were going down to appear in a special Saturday session before the grand jury, and the Friday night before, when we went to visit with the prosecutors, there was a sheet that had been handed out by the White House on executive privilege, and at that point in April, sometime in April, the latter half of the month, executive privilege was still being claimed, particularly vis-a-vis the grand jury as well.
There was a speech to the President, I believe, on May 22nd on this subject. But that's really not important to this query, so we'll move on from that. I am anxious in the moments we have remaining to talk about first-hand information that you have, so-called, what I call Category 1 information, direct knowledge.
Yes, sir.
What the President knew and when he knew it. So if you'd move on into those categories.
Well, it was in the meeting on the 27th that the President urged me to, he reported the fact that you would ask that your contact not be anybody at the White House, rather somebody, very specifically the Attorney General, Mr. Kleindienst. And I was asked by the President then to make sure that Kleindienst had, in fact, met with you. I had met with Kleindienst the preceding day, as I recall, in a general discussion, and he had indicated to me that he wanted to turn over the FBI materials. I don't think he was aware at that point in time, well, he could have been aware of that. Yes, he may have been aware at that point in time of the fact that you were to be the contact point for the hearings, and he had not yet scheduled a meeting with you I don't know what conversations he'd had with you, but he had said that he hadn't worked out a firm date to have these hearings, that he was hoping to meet with both you and the chairman.
You know, in fact, that when he did meet with us...
No, I do not.
But do you know that it was with me and Senator Erb?
That was my understanding, yes. That was his desire. Apparently, you indicated you wanted to meet with both. Thought it would be most effective if the meeting was with both you and the chairman, and that's what Mr. Klein reported to me.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dean.
Well, as I've also testified, there was some discussion of the composition of the committee. He felt that at that point in time he hoped that the White House could receive some assistance from you. That's why he was hoping that, urging me to have the Attorney General work closely with you. We discussed Senator Gurney. Senator Gurney, the President said no one has to get in touch with him. He'll do what's right. He felt very comfortable that that was our best friend on the committee.
Let's tell you one other thing. I noticed in one of the memos, one of the exhibits, that the mention was made of Attorney General Kleindienst and of you as a possible communication point for committee affairs.
It was Wally Johnson or myself, I believe.
Well, would you confirm that you and I have never discussed that?
Yes, sir, I would.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I might add, jumping forward in the meeting, though, there at one point in the meeting on March 22nd, when Mr. Mitchell was with the President, there was a call as a result of a staff inquiry from a member of your staff that said that still seeking guidance, and this report had come to the President from Mr. Timmons, and during the middle of the meeting, the President picked up the phone and tried to, or called the Attorney General and said, you know, get on up there and meet with Senator Baker and work these problems out. At that meeting also, he told me, he said, John, you should start having direct dealings with Senator Ervin and Senator Baker on the parameters of executive privilege. This was right in the middle of the Gray hearings, and I told the President, I said, I think that would be very unwise, Mr. President, because I'm the point in controversy in the Gray hearings, and I'd be up there negotiating my own position, so to speak.
Remember, too, at that time, the chairman was talking about arresting people at the White House gate.
That is correct.
The President was talking about having a lawsuit.
I also remember one of having a discussion with the Attorney General about this area, and he told me, he said we have more marshals than they have sergeant at arms, and if we run out of marshals, your boss has got the army.
Go ahead, Mr. Dean.
Now, it was something that occurred that was very similar to it, the September 15th meeting. After we'd had these discussions, on my way out of the office, he again repeated to me that I had done an excellent job of dealing with the matter during the campaign with the Watergate problem. He said that it had been the only issue that the McGovern people had, that the Democrats and had tried to make a big issue out of it, and I told him that I'd only managed to contain the matter during the campaign, and again, feeling that I didn't know how long the cover-up could go on, that this thing could go on indefinitely. I was trying.
Did you use the word cover-up?
I used the word contain. And he said to me, I said, I'm not sure it can be contained indefinitely. He then, I can recall this very vividly, he said, John, he said, I've got a lot of confidence in you, and he said, you know, we have to just keep fighting back, and I'm sure you can do it, and I want you to report directly to me on all your problems and not bother Bob and John, referring to Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
Did you feel at that time that the President had confidence in you?
Did I feel? As I think I testified earlier, I thought that I had earned my stripes by that time, so to speak. Somebody else classified, I think, Senator Montoya as I'd gotten my spurs. And I felt he did. Yes, sir.
Mr. Dean, it's 4:45, and I've covered much territory, and I have much other that I've already mentioned to you I'd like to cover, but at this point I'd like to yield. Senator Talmadge has not returned. I understand that he's finished his interrogation for this round, and the next one would be Senator Weicker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dean, just a couple of preliminary questions before I get into the main thrust of questioning. And this asks for an opinion, admittedly so, but I'd still like to hear it. On April the 30th, 1973, the President announced your resignation, along with Messrs. Kleindienst, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. And the President had some very warm things to say about Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman. Not very much to say about you, and only very little to say about Mr. Kleindienst. Would you care to opine as to why this particular treatment?
I don't want to offer an opinion. I'll just say this, that given the fact that I wasn't playing ball, I wasn't surprised. And I might also add this, that I thought it was somewhat unfair to put Mr. Kleindienst's name amongst the others that were leaving the White House staff at that time. I had a definite reaction to that. I thought that was unfair to Mr. Kleindienst, who had, as I understood it, proffered his own resignation, and then suddenly it was lumped with others who there'd been a great deal of press speculation about being involved in the Watergate.
You had information that Mr. Kleindienst indeed had offered his resignation prior to this time?
No, I didn't. I heard that subsequently, that he had proffered it.
Now, one other brief question. The committee has received evidence that a courier for Senator Muskie's campaign microfilm documents, which were typed by Sally Duncan, Bart Porter's secretary, and delivered by her to Gordon Strachan at the White House. This was an earlier testimony before this committee. Now, what do you know about the source of the list of Muskie contributors, which list you provided to the committee yesterday?
The only thing I know about that list is it was sent to me from Mr. Colson's office.
Now, Mr. Dean, the line of questioning which I'm going to follow is going to include you to some extent, it's going to include me to some extent. But one of the jobs that I think we have is to preserve the opportunity for every individual to be heard, and heard fairly when they come before this committee, whether it's you or any other witness, and to probe fairly, as has been the case by the members of this committee. Obviously, the seriousness of the matter before us also makes it imperative that the committee itself and each member of the committee have credibility and be believed. Now, our job, in other words, here I look upon as getting to the facts, not to get the president. And to have the United States or Americans feel as to exactly what it is that happened to their political system, and in fact what happened to their Constitution. With that in mind, I now intend to review some of your testimony and to also review some of the things that have happened. Certainly, I and the committee, the American people, have seen things that have been illegal, They've seen things that have been unconstitutional, and they've seen and heard those things which I could only categorize as gross. But to get to the issue of the credibility of witnesses, I first want to find out what your comments would be to the memorandum that was read to you by Senator Inouye. Except this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out to you and to the American people the difference between the first memorandum that was sent to the committee and the second memorandum that was sent to Senator Inouye. The first memorandum sent from Mr. Fred Bazart at the White House made the following statement. History fails to record that at that moment Dean corrected the Attorney General's erroneous impression by pointing out that however innocently Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean had all been involved in planning of operations of which Watergate was an obvious derivative, or that Strawn had knowledge of the fruits of this kind of operation, or that all of them were suborning perjury and otherwise seeking to conceal the facts. Now let me show you the key difference between the first and the second versions. The first version, here I'm going to cut it off. History fails to record that at that moment Dean corrected the Attorney General's erroneous impression by pointing out that however innocently Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean. The memorandum which was read to you by Senator Inouye, which was the second memorandum to come from the White House, read as follows. History fails to record that at the moment Dean corrected the Attorney General's erroneous impression by pointing out that Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean, in other words, admitting, however innocently. Now, to get to further aspects of the memorandum, the first memorandum stated, it is probable, because of executive privilege, it is not possible even to speculate on the extent to which Dean helped induce the views on attorney-client privilege. The second version of the memorandum read, it is probable that Dean helped induce the views on attorney-client privilege. Then again, in the first version of the memorandum given to this committee by Mr. Bazart and the White House, the statement was made in the first edition. The President indicated to Ehrlichman that his conversations with Dean throughout the preceding month had given him a growing awareness of Dean's personal involvement, and that his sending him to Camp David apparently was a device to smoke him out. The second version that came from the White House reads as follows. The President indicated to Ehrlichman that his conversations with Dean throughout the preceding month had given him a growing awareness of Dean's personal involvement in this period. And then, lastly, let me be patient here. The first version. Dean was not merely one of the architects of the cover-up plan. He was also, perhaps, its most active participant. The second version from the White House. Dean was not merely one of the architects of the cover-up plan. He was also its most active participant. I think it's important to point out, Mr. Chairman, to the committee, the very substantial discrepancies in the two memorandums sent to this committee. But probably the greatest disservice performed by the White House in this instance comes on the following fact. And before I make my statement in regard to the entire memorandum, I'd like to read a quote from a speech given by the Vice President of the United States not long ago, where he goes ahead and blasts this committee in which speech he states, "There is no question whatever that some men, despite their innocence, will be ruined by all of this, even though I'm sure that the Senate intended nothing of this kind when it commissioned this investigation." And I think, Mr. Chairman, that the American people should know that the author of the White House memorandum, read by Senator Inouye yesterday, makes statements of facts concerning John Mitchell, which in effect assume that he took part in a conspiracy to break and enter, that he took part in obstructing justice and suborning perjury. And all this without an admission or conviction of John Mitchell. And this, Mr. Chairman, done in the document sent by the White House to this committee. I don't believe that in anything that the committee has done to date, we have overstepped our bounds to this extent. And I think it important to note, not only in the case of Mr. Dean, who sits before us, but also in the case of Mr. Mitchell, who is to come before us.